The first police siren cut through the cold New Year's Eve air just as my father screamed, "Get out of my house, Emily, or I swear I'm calling the cops." The words hit harder than the freezing wind whipping across the front lawn. Midnight was less than an hour away. Fireworks cracked in the distance, neighbors laughed, music pulsed through nearby houses. And there I was, standing barefoot on my childhood porch, coat half-zipped, suitcase still inside, staring at the man who raised me as if he were a stranger. My dad's face was red, anger, alcohol, or both. His hands shook as he pointed toward the driveway like I was a trespasser, not his daughter. Not the girl who had slept in the upstairs bedroom for 18 years. Not the one who paid part of the mortgage after Mom died. "Don't test me," he said again, louder this time. "I'll call the cops." I remember thinking he was bluffing. I was wrong. My name is Emily, and until that night, I thought I knew exactly who my father was. Growing up, Dad was strict but predictable. Rules. Curfews. No excuses. After Mom passed away 3 years ago, it was just the two of us in that house. I stayed to help him grieve. To keep the lights on. To make sure he wasn't alone. I postponed moving out, postponed my own life, because family mattered, or at least I thought it did. Somewhere along the way, things changed. Dad started locking doors. Counting cash. Asking strange questions about my savings, my job, my plans. He'd make comments like, "This house should stay in the family," or "Everything you have is because of me." At first, I brushed it off as grief talking. But that New Year's Eve, the tension finally snapped. I had come home early from work, carrying groceries and a small cake. Dad had invited friends over, people I barely recognized. Loud voices. Whiskey bottles on the table. When I asked what was going on, he didn't answer. He just stared at me like I'd interrupted something important. Then he dropped it. "I need you out by tonight," he said flatly. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. "What?" "Dad, it's New Year's Eve." His eyes hardened. "I'm serious." I asked why. I asked where I was supposed to go. I asked what I'd done wrong. That's when he yelled it, the line that shattered everything. "Get out, or I call the cops." The room went silent. His friends avoided eye contact. Someone quietly turned down the music. I felt my chest tighten, like the air had been sucked out of the house along with my place in it. "You'd really do that?" I asked. He picked up his phone. I packed what I could carry. I tried to reason with him. I reminded him I helped pay bills. That my name was on nothing, but I had receipts for everything. He didn't care. He just kept saying the same thing, "You don't belong here anymore." When I stepped outside, the door slammed behind me. 5 minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights painted the house in colors I'd only ever seen from inside a car passing by. The cops pulled up slow, careful, hands resting near their belts. And that's when something inside me shifted. Because as the officers approached, my father stepped out too, calm now, composed, rehearsed. He spoke first. I watched him point at me like I was a problem he'd finally decided to solve. That's when I realized this wasn't just a fight. This was a setup. As one officer asked for my ID, another glanced back at the house. The windows glowed warm and golden. Laughter resumed inside. Midnight crept closer. I stood in the cold, heart pounding, wondering how a man could erase his own daughter so easily, and why he looked almost relieved to do it. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, right there on the lawn, was the beginning of something much bigger. Because when the cops arrived, they didn't just change my New Year's plans. They uncovered a truth my father never wanted anyone to see. And as the countdown to midnight echoed in the distance, I felt it deep in my bones. This wasn't over. Not even close. The police left after 20 minutes. 20 minutes of questions. 20 minutes of my father standing behind them with his arms crossed, watching me like I was a stranger who'd wandered onto his property. The officers were polite, neutral. Legally, the house was his. My name wasn't on the deed. They told me I'd need to leave for the night. What they didn't say out loud was worse. He planned this. I spent New Year's night in my car, parked 3 blocks away, heater barely working, watching fireworks bloom faintly over rooftops that no longer felt safe. I didn't cry. Not yet. I was too busy replaying the last few months in my head, searching for the moment things went wrong. Because this hadn't started that night. The red flags had been there long before the cops ever showed up. It began with the money conversations. After Mom died, Dad insisted we simplify things. He said it was just easier if I transferred part of my savings into his account so he could manage household expenses. I hesitated, but he reminded me how much he'd sacrificed raising me. How Mom would have wanted us united. I agreed, reluctantly, foolishly. Soon after, he stopped showing me bills. Whenever I asked, he'd snap, "Don't you trust me?" Or he'd sigh dramatically and say I was stressing him out. I backed off, feeling guilty for questioning my own father. That guilt became a leash he pulled whenever I got too curious. Then came the phone calls. Late-night calls he'd take outside. Calls he'd lower his voice for. If I entered the room, he'd end them quickly, saying, "Just business." But my dad never had business. He'd retired early. The house was paid off, or so he always claimed. Once, I heard my name through the door. "No, she doesn't know," he said. "Not yet." I asked him about it the next morning. He laughed, told me I was imagining things, accused me of eavesdropping. Somehow, I ended up apologizing. That became the pattern. Every time something felt off, I was made to feel dramatic. Ungrateful. Suspicious for no reason. Then there was the favoritism. A year earlier, Dad had reconnected with his younger brother, my uncle, a man who'd barely been around my entire childhood. Suddenly, he was everywhere. Sunday dinners. Holiday plans. Long private talks in the garage. Dad started comparing us. "Your uncle understands loyalty," he'd say. "Your uncle knows how to respect family." Each sentence landed like a quiet accusation. Around that time, Dad stopped calling my room my room. He'd refer to it as the spare room. Once, I came home to find boxes stacked against my wall. When I asked what they were, he shrugged. Just preparing for the future. The future apparently didn't include me. I noticed papers disappearing from our filing cabinet. When I searched for Mom's old documents, insurance, bank records, half of them were gone. Dad claimed he'd handled it already. Handled it how? He never said. The emotional strain built slowly, like pressure behind my ribs. I stopped sleeping well. I started double-checking my bank balance daily, only to realize chunks of money I couldn't explain were missing. When I asked Dad, he said expenses had gone up. When I asked which expenses, he exploded. That was the first time he yelled at me like that. Not raised voice. Not stern lecture. Full volume rage. He slammed his fist on the counter and shouted, "This house runs because of me." I remember shrinking back, stunned. He'd never scared me before. After that, I walked on eggshells. I avoided conversations. I stopped bringing friends over. I told myself it was temporary, that grief had twisted him, that things would calm down if I just stayed quiet. That silence cost me more than I realized. Because while I was trying to keep the peace, something else was happening behind my back. I found a folded envelope in the trash 2 weeks before New Year's Eve. My name was typed on it, but it wasn't addressed to me. Inside was a copy of a document, only 1 page, mentioning assets, beneficiaries, and signatures. Dad's signature. Someone else's initials beside it. The rest was missing. When I confronted him, he laughed again, too fast, too rehearsed. "That's nothing," he said. "Old paperwork. Stop digging." That was the moment doubt replaced denial. Standing in the cold on New Year's Eve, remembering that envelope, the secret calls, the missing money, it all lined up too neatly to be coincidence. The way he'd already been calm when the cops arrived. The way he spoke to them like he'd practiced. This wasn't about an argument. This was about removing me. As midnight passed and the world celebrated new beginnings, I sat in my car, phone glowing in the dark, scrolling through bank statements and old messages, my hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization settling in my chest. Whatever my father was hiding, I was standing in the way of it. And now, he'd made his choice. He'd chosen to call the cops on his own daughter. What I didn't know yet was just how far he was willing to go, and how much he thought I didn't know. But one thing was clear, the betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been building for months. And I was only just beginning to see it. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn crept over the rooftops, my phone battery was nearly dead, my head pounding from hours of unanswered questions. I watched people step outside in pajamas, laughing, hugging, celebrating the first morning of the year. I felt like I was watching life through thick glass, present, but already erased. At 7:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A notification from my bank. Large transfer completed. My stomach dropped. I refreshed the app. Then again. Then again. The balance I'd built over years, late nights, skipped vacations, extra shifts, was gone. Not reduced. Gone. Emptied down to a number so small it felt like a typo. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The transfer recipient was an account I recognized. My father's. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. There had to be an explanation. A mistake. Fraud. Anything other than the truth clawing its way to the surface. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I called again. And again. Nothing. My chest tightened as pieces snapped into place, the secret calls, the missing documents, the sudden urgency to get me out of the house. The envelope in the trash. The way he'd already been calm when the police arrived. He hadn't just kicked me out. He'd cleared me out. I drove straight to the house. The driveway was empty now. No police cars. No guests. Just the quiet, ordinary look of a place that had stopped being mine. I knocked. Then banged. Then shouted his name. No answer. I walked around to the back door. Locked. Every window shut tight. Through the glass, I saw it. My suitcase. Still sitting in the hallway, untouched. Like proof I'd never planned to leave. That's when rage finally cracked through the shock. I went to the bank as soon as it opened. I showed them the transfers. I explained everything in a rush that barely made sense even to me. The teller's expression shifted from confusion to concern to something heavier. She excused herself and came back with a manager. They pulled records. Time-stamped. Authorized. Signed. My father hadn't just moved my money. He'd added himself as a joint owner months ago. I stared at the screen as the manager pointed to a digital signature, mine. Or at least, something that looked like it. That's not my signature, I whispered. The manager hesitated. It matches the authorization on file. My ears rang. My vision blurred. While I was grieving. While I was trusting him. While I was trying to hold our family together, he'd been systematically positioning himself to take everything I had. The house. The savings. The assets Mom had left for me. I thought of her will. I'd seen it once, years ago. She'd been clear. What she earned went to me. What they built together stayed shared, but protected. She'd wanted me safe. Dad had always said, "I'll handle the paperwork." And I'd believed him. I left the bank numb, my emotions colliding all at once, grief, fury, humiliation, heartbreak. I felt stupid. Violated. Like my own blood had studied me long enough to know exactly how to dismantle me. I sat in my car and screamed until my throat burned. How could a father do this? Then the final confirmation came. A message from my uncle. Your dad says you moved out. House is finally quiet again. For the best. Finally quiet. As if I'd been noise. I confronted my father that evening, catching him as he pulled into the driveway. He looked startled for half a second, then composed, like he'd expected this moment. You stole from me, I said, my voice shaking. From your own daughter. He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed like I was the problem. That money was never really yours, he said calmly. Everything you have came from this family. Mom's face flashed in my mind. She left it to me, I said. She's gone, he snapped. And I'm still here. That sentence hurt more than the theft. I demanded my money back. I demanded answers. I demanded to know how he could call the cops on me after taking everything. His eyes hardened. I did what I had to do, he said. You were asking too many questions. Getting in the way. In the way of what? I asked. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Of securing my future. That was the moment the last piece fell into place. This wasn't panic. This wasn't grief. This was a calculated purge. He'd removed me from the house, from the accounts, from the picture, cleanly, legally, efficiently. And he'd used the police to make it official. I walked away before I did something I couldn't take back. But as I drove off, one thought burned hotter than the rest. He thought he'd won. He thought I was powerless. He thought calling the cops was the end of it. He was wrong. Because now I knew exactly what he'd done. And once betrayal is exposed, it stops being silent. It starts becoming a reckoning. For 3 days after that confrontation, I felt hollow. Not sad. Not angry. Empty. I stayed on a friend's couch, staring at the ceiling at night, replaying every memory of my childhood like evidence in a case I didn't want to prosecute. Birthdays. School pickups. Dad teaching me how to ride a bike. Him holding my hand at Mom's funeral, promising we'd always have each other. I wondered when that promise expired. I barely ate. My phone buzzed with notifications I ignored, work emails, bank follow-ups, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I told myself I needed time to breathe. To grieve the father I thought I had. But grief didn't stay quiet. It kept changing shape. On the 4th morning, I finally opened my laptop, not to distract myself, but because something inside me refused to stay still any longer. I logged into my cloud storage, scrolling through years of digital clutter, old tax files, scanned documents, random photos. That's when I saw it. A folder labeled Mom Originals. My breath caught. I hadn't opened it since before she died. Back then, I couldn't bear to look at anything that reminded me of paperwork and hospitals and endings. With shaking hands, I clicked it open. Inside were scanned copies of her will. Not summaries. Not drafts. Originals. Clear. Specific. Signed. Witnessed. I read every line slowly, forcing myself not to rush, not to hope too hard. And there it was. A clause Dad had never mentioned. A clause that changed everything. Mom had left her personal assets, savings, investments, insurance payouts, directly to me. But more than that, she'd included a safeguard. Any attempt to alter, transfer, or access those assets without my consent would constitute fraud and void Dad's administrative control entirely. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. He hadn't handled the paperwork. He'd hidden it. I kept reading. Another document sat beneath the will, a letter addressed to me. Not typed. Handwritten. My hands trembled as I zoomed in. Emily, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to protect you anymore. So I need you to protect yourself. Tears blurred my vision. She wrote about love. About trust. About how grief can twist people in ways you don't expect. She wrote that she hoped Dad would always do right by me, but that hope wasn't a guarantee. If someone tries to make you feel small, indebted, or afraid to ask questions, she wrote, remember this, you were never meant to disappear to make someone else comfortable. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my face. That was the trigger. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. I wasn't weak. I'd been kind. I'd trusted. And someone had mistaken that for permission. For the first time since New Year's Eve, my spine straightened. I stood up, paced the room, wiped my face, and picked up my phone, not to call my father, but to make a list. Every red flag. Every transaction. Every date something felt wrong. I wrote down times, amounts, names. I pulled bank records, screenshots, emails. I requested archived footage from the bank branch where the account changes were made. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it all, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to prove. Later that day, I returned to the house while Dad was out. I didn't break in. I didn't cause a scene. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at it from across the street, the place that had held my entire life. For the first time, it didn't look powerful. It looked exposed. I remembered the filing cabinet. The drawer he'd emptied. The documents that had gone missing. I remembered the way he'd rushed me out, how desperate he'd been to get me gone before I noticed what else had changed. That desperation told me something important. People who are winning don't rush. That night, I slept, for real, for the first time in days. And when I woke up, I didn't feel heavy. I felt focused. I called the bank again, this time calm and prepared. I asked precise questions. I requested formal copies. I used words like unauthorized, forged, fiduciary breach. The tone of the conversation changed instantly. I wasn't a confused daughter anymore. I was a problem. By evening, I'd booked a consultation with a lawyer, not out of rage, but out of respect for myself. I brought the documents. The will. The letter. The statements. As I laid everything out on the table, the lawyer looked up at me and said something I'll never forget. He didn't just betray you. He underestimated you. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in years. Because the truth was no longer something haunting me. It was something standing beside me. My father had used authority to erase me. He'd used the police to silence me. He'd used my trust as a weapon against me. But what he hadn't counted on, what he couldn't control, was the moment when pain stops asking why and starts asking how. How do I reclaim what's mine? How do I expose the truth? How do I make sure this never happens again? As I stepped into the cold evening air, I looked up at the darkening sky and thought of Mom's words. You were never meant to disappear. And for the first time since that night on the lawn, I smiled. Because I wasn't running anymore. I was coming back, prepared. I didn't rush. That was the first rule I made for myself. Rushing was how I'd lost everything in the first place, by trusting timelines that weren't mine, by believing urgency meant honesty. This time, every step would be deliberate. Quiet. Documented. If my father thought calling the cops had scared me off, I was about to let him keep believing that. Step 1, proof. The lawyer helped me file formal requests, paper trails Dad couldn't erase. Bank authorization logs. IP addresses from online account changes. Branch surveillance timestamps. Every signature he claimed was mine was examined line by line. The more we looked, the uglier it became. The joint account addition. Done on a weekday morning while I was clocked in at work, verified by my employer's records. The digital signature. Copied from an old scanned document I'd uploaded years earlier. The timing. Carefully spaced, months apart, so nothing looked sudden. This wasn't impulsive theft. It was slow, intentional extraction. Step 2, silence. I didn't contact him again. I didn't argue. I didn't show up unannounced. From his perspective, I'd disappeared, exactly what he wanted. That silence made him bold. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard snippets. He was telling people I'd lost it. That grief had made me unstable. That he'd had no choice but to protect himself. He even joked about starting the new year lighter. I let him talk. Every lie he told without pressure became another knot in the rope he was weaving around himself. Step 3, observation. I learned his routine again, not by following him, but by listening. People underestimate how much they reveal when they think the story is over. He started meeting with a financial advisor. He listed the house for refinancing. He spoke openly about consolidating assets. That mattered. Because Mom's will didn't just protect money. It restricted movement. Any attempt to restructure or liquidate her assets without my consent triggered an automatic review. One that would drag everything into the light. Step 4, the trap. The lawyer advised patience, but patience didn't mean passivity. We prepared a formal notice, polite, neutral, devastating. It didn't accuse. It requested clarification. About signatures. About authorization. About asset transfers. It was designed to do one thing, force him to respond on record. Before sending it, we waited. We let him refinance the house. We let him feel secure. Because confidence makes people sloppy. While he celebrated what he thought was a clean escape, we quietly filed a fraud review with the bank's internal investigation unit. Not criminal. Not yet. Just enough to freeze further movement without alerting him immediately. That freeze would hit at the worst possible time. Step 5, timing. The anniversary of Mom's death was approaching. Dad always hosted a small gathering that day, friends, family, sympathetic faces. He liked to play the role of the widower who'd held everything together. We chose that week. Not out of cruelty, but because lies collapse fastest when built on performance. The notice went out on a Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed for the first time in days. Dad. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, controlled, irritated, confused. Emily, I don't know what game you're playing, but this has gone far enough. Game. By Wednesday, his tone changed. Call me. We need to talk. By Thursday night, it cracked. This is a misunderstanding. You're making things worse than they need to be. I saved every message. Meanwhile, the bank freeze kicked in. His refinancing stalled. His advisor stopped returning calls. Accounts he'd been moving money through went static. He still had control, on paper, but suddenly, nothing was moving. That was the tension point. He felt it. I knew because he showed up at my workplace. Not inside. Outside. Waiting. I watched him through the glass, pacing, checking his watch, rehearsing expressions in his reflection. When he finally saw me, relief flashed across his face, followed quickly by irritation when I didn't approach. I walked past him like he wasn't there. That shook him more than yelling ever could. The next day, my lawyer received his response to the notice. Defensive. Vague. Careless. He claimed verbal consent. He referenced conversations that never happened. He contradicted dates already locked in by records. In trying to explain himself, he documented his own guilt. And still, he thought he was in control. He told people I was trying to extort him. That I'd turned against family. That I was being manipulated by outsiders. I let him. Because the closer we got to the truth, the louder his lies became. By the end of the week, everything was ready. The documentation. The timelines. The expert reviews. All of it stacked neatly, waiting. The lawyer looked at me across the table and asked, "Are you ready to proceed?" I thought of the night he pointed at me and threatened to call the cops. I thought of standing barefoot on the porch, erased from my own life. I nodded. Yes. Because revenge isn't loud when it's done right. It's precise. And the next step wouldn't just take back what he stole. It would force him to face what he'd done, under lights he couldn't turn off. He still thought he'd won. That illusion was about to shatter. The courtroom didn't look like justice. It looked small. Beige walls. Hard benches. Fluorescent lights that made everything feel flatter than it was. No drama. No music. No sense that a life had been dismantled piece by piece. And yet, this was where everything came apart. My father sat at the defense table in a dark suit I recognized, one he only wore when he wanted to look respectable. His hair was neatly combed. His posture relaxed. He nodded at people who glanced his way, playing the part of the calm, wronged parent. He still thought this was a misunderstanding. Still thought authority would protect him. When I walked in, he didn't look at me at first. When he did, his expression tightened, not fear, not guilt, annoyance. Like I was late to a meeting he shouldn't have had to attend. The judge entered. Everyone rose. And just like that, the man who had screamed, "Get out," or "I call the cops," no longer controlled the room. The first hour was procedural. Dry. Motions. Dates. My father's lawyer spoke confidently, framing the situation as a family dispute complicated by grief. He suggested I'd been dependent. Emotional. Confused. I let him talk. Then it was our turn. My lawyer stood and did something unexpected. She didn't start with money. She started with New Year's Eve. She described the police call, the forced removal, the timing, hours before midnight. She asked my father, directly, why he felt the need to involve law enforcement against his own daughter. He answered smoothly, "I felt threatened." She refused to leave. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Threatened how?" He paused. Just a second too long. She was unstable. That word echoed. My lawyer nodded, then tapped a button. The courtroom speakers crackled. A recording played. My father's voice, raised, furious, unmistakable. "Get out, or I call the cops." No threat in my voice. No screaming. Just his. The room shifted. My father stiffened. That recording was taken without consent, his lawyer objected. It was taken in a one-party consent state, my lawyer replied calmly. And it's relevant to intent. The judge allowed it. Then came the documents. Bank records projected onto a screen. Dates highlighted. Transfers circled. My work attendance logs cross-referenced with account modifications. The forged signature enlarged, compared side by side with verified originals. My father leaned back, jaw tight. Still composed. Still confident. Until my lawyer introduced the will. Not a copy. The original scanned document, verified and time-stamped years before any account changes. She read the clause out loud. The one about unauthorized access. The one about fraud. The one that stripped him of control. My father's lawyer whispered urgently to him. He waved her off. Then came the final blow. The bank investigator took the stand. She testified that the refinancing attempt had triggered an internal alert, because assets tied to my mother's estate were suddenly being moved without beneficiary approval. She explained the freeze. The stalled funds. The review. And then she said the word that drained the color from my father's face. Referral. Criminal. Not yet charged, but documented. For the first time, he looked at me like he didn't recognize me at all. The judge leaned forward. "Mr." he said, "you involved police to remove your daughter from her home hours before these transfers completed. Can you explain why?" Silence. The judge didn't raise his voice. That made it worse. My father swallowed. "I wanted privacy." The judge nodded slowly. "From your daughter, or from scrutiny?" That was it. The illusion shattered. The judge ruled swiftly. Assets returned. Control revoked. Emergency injunction granted. A formal investigation ordered into the forged authorizations. But the moment that stayed with me, the one that felt cinematic, didn't come from the ruling. It came after. As we stood to leave, my father turned toward me, his voice low, furious, shaking. "You didn't have to destroy me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something surprising. "Nothing. You destroyed yourself," I said quietly. I just stopped disappearing. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Not a mob, just enough. Someone asked what it felt like to take legal action against my own father. I answered honestly. It felt necessary. Behind me, my father stood frozen on the steps, surrounded by whispers, his authority stripped bare in public daylight. The same man who'd threatened to call the cops now avoided eye contact with officers standing nearby. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As I walked away, I thought of that night on the lawn, the flashing lights, the cold air, the certainty that I was powerless. And I smiled. Because power hadn't come from revenge. It had come from truth, documented, undeniable, irreversible. And for the first time, he knew exactly what it felt like to be removed. The house went quiet after the ruling. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the hollow kind. The kind that echoes when something loud has finally stopped pretending it belongs. Within weeks, everything unraveled for my father. The accounts were restored to their rightful structure. My name, my real authority, was reinstated where it had always belonged. The assets tied to my mother's will were locked down under court supervision, and every attempt he'd made to control them was documented, frozen and reversed. The investigation didn't move loudly. It didn't need to. Banks stopped returning his calls. Advisors suddenly rescheduled. Friends who once praised his strength found reasons to be unavailable. The same people who had believed his version of events now avoided the topic entirely. Truth has a way of making cowards quiet. He still lived in the house, but it no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a waiting room. Refinancing fell through. The equity he'd counted on vanished behind legal walls he couldn't breach. Every letter he received came with warnings instead of promises. And the cops. They never came for me again. But they did knock on his door, twice, for follow-up questions he couldn't deflect with authority or volume. As for me, life didn't magically become easy. It became clear. I moved into my own place. Small. Bright. Mine. The first night there, I slept on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and felt safer than I ever had under that old roof. I stopped apologizing for asking questions. I stopped shrinking my voice to keep someone else comfortable. People at work noticed the change. Friends did too. There's something about standing up to the person who raised you that recalibrates your spine. You don't walk the same afterward. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle. It was accepting that the man who should have protected me was the one I needed protection from. I grieved that quietly. Honestly. Without excuses. I didn't forgive him. But I released the version of myself that kept hoping he'd become someone else. That was freedom. Months later, I passed the house one last time, not to look back, but to close the loop. The windows were dark. The lawn overgrown. A for sale sign leaned crooked in the yard. He couldn't keep it. Not after everything. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. Some victories don't need witnesses. The poetic justice didn't come from watching him fall. It came from realizing I no longer needed to look. Because the same man who once pointed at me and said, "Get out," or "I call the cops," now lived under rules he couldn't bend, while I lived a life he could never touch. He tried to erase me. Instead, he exposed himself. And that's the thing about betrayal, when you survive it, you don't just get your life back. You get your name back. Your voice. Your future. So let me ask you something, directly. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you? Have you ever been made to feel small for trusting the wrong person? If this story hit close to home, share your thoughts in the comments. You're not alone, and your silence isn't strength. Your clarity is. And if you want more stories about betrayal, truth, and the quiet power of standing your ground, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes, the most satisfying justice isn't revenge. It's becoming untouchable.